it created a legal obstacle to the machinery of the Holocaust, because one of the preconditions of what the Nazis were doing was effectively to create what we could call an extra legal space, where there was no the individuals themselves had no legal rights at all.
The forgotten Holocaust story of the passport forgers who helped 10,000 Jews escape the Nazis. You may have heard the Times journalist Daniel Finkelstein talking about this on Times Radio around the publication of his recent memoir, as his mother was one of those 10,000 Jews who were effectively saved by a fake passport. The historian Roger Moorhouse is the author of The Forgers, and he joins me now. Hello, Roger.
Hello, Hugo.
Very nice to have you on this morning. Look, the forgers were a group of Polish diplomats who issued fake documents and visas to help Jews escape the Nazis, right? Where were they based?
They were based in Switzerland. I should add it was Polish diplomats and Jewish activists together. It was a joint effort. But they were based in Switzerland, based out of the Polish embassy in Bern. It's known as the Lados group. The leader of that group was the ambassador Alexander Lados.
Right. Okay. And look, can you tell us a bit more about who other members of this group were, the forgers, and particularly tell me about Alexander Lados, who, as you said, was a sort of key member of the group.
Yeah. So he was the ambassador. He was sent to post in 1940. He was the Polish ambassador in Switzerland, and he was sort of headed up the operation. He had his own background was in Poland, in Lviv, in eastern Poland. And he was, quite sympathetic to the sort of Jewish plight. Certainly, he'd encountered Jews who had helped him escape Poland in 1939. He'd also, in his own life, had been exiled from the Polish lands by the Austrians in 1915 and ended up in Austria, and had then escaped with a fake passport. So he had a sort of tradition in his own life of using clandestine methods and fake documents. So he sort of headed it up. Go on.
No, sorry, I was going to say. And so, how did it actually work? What did they actually do? People got in touch with them and just asked for documents?
Yeah, essentially, they realised once the Holocaust gets underway in end of 1941, they realise they're getting increasing numbers of sort of requests for documents, often very impassioned and desperate requests. To help people sort of survive, escape deportation, and so on, from occupied Poland into the death camps and into the ghettos and so on. And they devised a plan by which they would use local honorary consuls of Latin American countries to illegally produce documents for them, identity documents for them. And most of them, about 70% of what they produced were Paraguayan. So they would pay the Paraguayan honorary consul, who was a Swiss, to supply blank documents, which they would then fill out and would be returned to the honorary consul for stamping and so on. And those would then be spirited back into occupied Poland. And essentially, it sort of it created a legal obstacle to the machinery of the Holocaust, because one of the preconditions of what the Nazis were doing was effectively to create what we could call an extra legal space, where there was no the individuals themselves had no legal rights at all. So it sort of reasserted at least the semblance of some legal framework and some legal rights. So it sort of played into that Nazi bureaucratism as well.
And how complicit, if complicit isn't exactly the wrong word, but how complicit in this were the Latin American nations themselves? Was it just the sort of consuls acting freelance, or did they have a degree of kind of blessing from the countries themselves?
No, the consuls were acting freelance at the beginning, and there is the sort of crisis in this plan was that the Latin American governments themselves got wind of it in 1943 and were not very happy with their passports being used in this way. So there's this sort of the second half of the book effectively is sort of an extended diplomatic wrangle on one level at least between the Latin American governments and to a large extent the Polish government in exile, which is then based in London, and the Jewish aid agencies, the last two of whom were busy trying to persuade anyone that would listen to put pressure on the Latin Americans to publicly say that they would recognize those passports, because the alternative was effectively a death sentence for those 10,000 Jews that had been supplied with papers.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had a great uncle myself who wound up escaped the Holocaust to Brazil, and I'm sort of now wondering afresh how he managed to get there because we've never quite understood it. What did the Nazis think about all this? They must have known that these papers were often forged, were fake.
Yeah.
Did they sort of put up with it? Was it helpful in some way to them to have this category of Jews that were somehow more valuable because of their papers? What was their position?
Yeah, it was. It's an interesting. They became effectively complicit in this scheme because they realizing that they had these large numbers of, in inverted commas, foreign Jews in their midst. They there were two sort of schools of thought between the foreign ministry, which was actually quite rational about it, and the SS, which was a lot more sort of rabid. But they both thought that these Jews, as foreign Jews, could be sort of utilized, could be leveraged in some way. And they essentially wanted to collect them up, these foreign Jews, and the idea was that they could then be exchanged for German citizens held abroad. So they were classified as exchange Jews, and very often they were sent to somewhere like Belsen, which has a dreadful reputation in the English, British historiography, because it was liberated by the British. But actually was a sort of hybrid camp and was used as an internment camp for all sorts of categories of prisoner, and a lot of the exchange Jews were sent there. So the idea at some point was that they'd be exchanged. I mean, very, very few, a tiny proportion were ever actually exchanged. But that was the idea on the German side, that if they were foreign Jews, then they would be of use, to be leveraged in that way.
And the forgers themselves, what kind of risks were they taking? Were they often arrested? Were they discovered by the Nazis? Were they detected? How much risk were they at?
Yeah, they were in Switzerland, of course, which was neutral and was safe territory. So we have to put that out at the beginning. But that said, Switzerland itself was sort of running a rather difficult balancing act. Had to satisfy some of the demands of its German neighbours. So it was in a very difficult situation itself. So it had to comply with to some extent with a lot of demands from Berlin. And one of which in 1943 was to shut down the Lados passport operation. The Germans actually sent a couple of agents to try and infiltrate it as well through 1942, which is quite an interesting story in itself, unsuccessfully. And then finally prevailed upon the Swiss police to shut the operation down, which they did essentially by going after the honorary consuls and removing their ability to operate as honorary consuls. So there's a degree of jeopardy there, but perhaps not life-threatening. But nonetheless, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that this was moral bravery of the first order. To actually see what was going on and to act in a way that was absolutely humane, when so many countless others were willing to avert their gaze and pretend it wasn't happening. I think is a profound moral bravery on display.
And so Jews who were lucky enough to end up with these passports, what were the courses of action open to them? Presumably, I mean, was it usually something that they would hold on to for when the knock on the door came? Or would they head to the border straight away and try their luck? Practically, of what use were they?
Yeah, in most cases, I think that the Jews themselves considered the passports or the identity documents to be a sort of last resort, because they knew they were faked as well. So it's something to be held in reserve. And in many cases, it was only sort of deployed once you were about to be deported. So you sort of pull out your Paraguayan passport or the sort of facsimile copy of it, which is what was usually sent on, and sort of declare you can't do this to me, I'm a Paraguayan. And as I said, generally they then got pulled out of the line and sent to somewhere like Belsen, where they then had to survive, in many cases 18 months or 2 years in rapidly deteriorating and hideous conditions. So very often the big question was actually surviving that process as much as it was surviving the mechanism of the Holocaust. But they tended to be kept in reserve until the last moment, because they knew they were forgeries anyway. So I think there was a rather failing faith in those documents until they actually proved their worth.
And look, the involvement of so many Poles in this, albeit often in Switzerland, should that change the way we think about the involvement of Poland and Poles in the Holocaust? Because I mean, Poles often have a bad reputation for anti-Semitism during
Mm.
that period, and a sort of complex association with some Nazi crimes, much of it's deeply disputed in Poland itself. Is this a
Yeah,
sign that actually, I mean, should we take on board? Look, no, it was actually much more complicated than that.
it is, and that's the word. It is much more complicated, and I think we have to embrace that. The sort of black and white view of history, binary view of history of heroes and villains and so on is rather simplistic. And you know, this story doesn't negate any of that stuff. It doesn't negate the bad responses that Poles and many others. I mean, every society was under German occupation was you know, had a spectrum of responses to the German occupation and to the Holocaust, and Poland was no exception in that. This doesn't negate that, but it's another part of that shared and very complex and painful history. So I'm not trying to whitewash anything. I'm just trying to tell a slightly different story.
Danny Finkelstein, who we mentioned earlier, whose mother benefited from such a passport, was held in Belsen because of it. He believes that Alexander Lados should be declared righteous among the nations, an accolade conferred by Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, to people who helped Jews during the Holocaust, an accolade given to non-Jews who risked their own lives to save Jews. Do you agree with that?
I do. Absolutely. I think it's an oversight so far. I mean, the Lados group was really sort of hiding in the shadows and in the archives until comparatively recently. So I'm sure it is just an oversight. One of the members of the group, Konstanty Rokitsky, who actually filled out all most of the documents, so his handwriting is on all of the passport, most of the passports. He was declared righteous, I think, in 2017, 2018. So I think it's probably just a matter of time until Lados is also given that accolade, and also his fellow conspirator Stefan Riniewicz, who was also involved with the operation. So I'm sure that's just an oversight. As I said, there are many cases like Rokitsky himself, you know, who was working with Lados very closely. So if Rokitsky has been granted it, it seems logical that Lados and Riniewicz should be granted it also.